Imagine living in a place with more radiation contamination than Fukushima, by some measures more than Chernobyl. Now imagine living there for decades as the government did everything it could to hide the truth and deny the devastating effects on health. That's what's happened to hundreds of thousands of people near the Russian city of Chelyabinsk. The region's home to one of the Soviet Union's first atomic weapons complexes and also the site of one of the world's worst nuclear disasters. But don't be surprised if you've never heard of it. Moscow correspondent Norman Hermant reports.
To illustrate the ravages of Soviet industrial policy, it's hard to go past the scarred landscape of Chelyabinsk on the eastern side of the Ural Mountains. So many defense and heavy industries were crammed here. Until the late 1980s, the whole region was off limits to foreigners. About 80 kilometers north, there was a model city not found on any maps. Known variously as City 40, Chelyabinsk 65, and now Ozersk, it is still closed to outsiders. It was built to house the workers at Mayak, one of the USSR's most secret nuclear facilities, one that is still leaving a devastating legacy. All over this region, a third generation of severely handicapped children is being born. Timosha Kadichnikov suffers from infantile cerebral paralysis. His family has no doubt it's linked to radiation contamination, but they don't have the money for tests to prove it. They've given up hope the government will acknowledge any connection.
This is just unrealistic. I do not want to even think about that. That will never happen in my life.
Milana Rodina is mentally challenged and was born with hyperkinetic disorder. Her muscles tense from day to night, and she's in constant motion for nearly every waking minute.
There
are many people with cancers. I think all the nervous diseases that a lot of local people have are linked with radiation.
In 1948, the USSR was racing to build its atomic arsenal, and Mayak's reactor began producing the plutonium for the first Soviet nuclear bombs. For the next 2 decades, huge quantities of radioactive waste were dumped directly into a river and lakes. Today, they remain officially off limits.
As soon as the factory was set up, they just started dropping radioactive waste straight into the Teisha River, and they dropped in much more than Chernobyl.
People still live on the banks of the river, despite massive contamination after a nuclear waste tank exploded in 1957. At least 400,000 people were directly affected, but almost no one was told the river had become deadly.
People were walking up here to cross over to go to school, to work. The children were fishing and swimming over there.
Despite potentially lethal radiation levels in the river Teisha, villages like Muslumova weren't evacuated for decades. There were no wells for drinking water. People had to rely on the poisoned river. Genetic mutations soared. Environmentalists say this many people living in such a contaminated region for so long amounts to nothing less than a medical experiment.
It turned out that the Chernobyl disaster triggered us to examine the people, after which we started figuring out what kind of things had happened here. At first we thought it was a mere accident. Later it turned out it was a radioactive dump.
As the evidence stacked up, the government finally started moving people in Muslumova away from the river into a new village 2 kilometers down the road. But that has done little to make life easier for families here. 15-year-old Kamil Akhmadiev is another child with a severe mental handicap. He is one of more than 22,000 cases that the government has reluctantly confirmed is connected to contamination. His mother reads from the official documents that prove it.
The disease is linked with the contaminated area. So contaminated and all of that sort of thing. It's linked with that.
Despite proof of a link, there's no money to treat her son, and their pensions barely cover the rent on the new house they were moved into. In some towns, residents are convinced the government's strategy is to wait until there's no one left alive to make any claims. Golshara Ismagilova has become a self-appointed activist in Karabolka, another village that straddles the contaminated Tesha River. In 1957, there were nearly 5,000 people living here. Now there are fewer than 300, and many are sick.
They
gradually die. They are sick, they are just tired. You can't dig yourself a grave when you are still alive. Here, it's the way they exist here and die. It's impossible to talk.
A simple walk down the road tells the story. First, a neighbor whose 2-year-old daughter's cancerous tumor has come back for the 3rd time. Her father is desperately searching for money for the latest operation. There are numerous houses here where people are bedridden, unable to walk for decades. It's a common condition for those who used to swim regularly in the river. And then there are the people living here with mental disabilities. Golshara Ismagilova says most of the children born here, if they survive, have some sort of handicap.
For 54 years, we are like experimental rabbits living on the land, because scientists come and wonder how a human can possibly live on such a contaminated land, where you can't even take a single step.
The cemetery may hold the answer about life here. It's filled with the graves of those who have died too young. Most of the deaths will never be officially linked to radiation from one of the world's worst nuclear disasters that remains mostly hidden from Russia and the world.